Hey guys, welcome. Thank you for coming. Whose first time is it here at Caveat? We give a round of applause to Caveat for hosting the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society again. Thank you for having us. So there was a small typo in our copy. This is actually supposed to be about psychedelic capitalism. I was having a bit of a rough night. Socialism clearly is a fantasy, so yeah, if you just replace that in your head. Just kidding, guys. I thought of an excellent summary of socialism and capitalism the other day while I was in the bathroom. Do you guys want to hear it? Okay. Socialism, this is going to be mind-blowing, and you're free to leave after you hear this if you want, if it's too much. Socialism is about sharing and why that's good. And capitalism is about why you shouldn't share and why that's good. Well, I thought it was kind of cool. I was in the bathroom, so. Anyways, thank you guys for coming tonight. I'd like to introduce our esteemed speaker. He is a good friend of mine. We've been through thick and thin in certain ways through the psychedelic scene here in New York, and I'm really glad and honored to be doing our first official one-on-one event together. Just friends, but good friends. He is a poet, a journalist, an author, a professor of English, and also a very, very, very damn good father. So I'd like to introduce to the stage my good friend, Nicholas Powers.
Thank you for saying that. Good, thank you for coming out. It's New York. There's a million and one things you could be doing. Otherwise, you could be doing LSD. So I appreciate you coming out. Psychedelics and socialism. I've lived in the kind of subterranean tunnels between those worlds. And yet I've never really seen any kind of map to go back and forth between those two worlds. So everything from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matters to Burning Man to Playa de Fuego to PEX to random art happenings in New York subways. Constantly going back and forth between these two worlds and not really having a map. So what I'd like to present for you today is a rough draft map of where I think these two worlds connect, and then open it up for questions, because this is really a collective new constitution, a collective statement that we're all going to have to be writing together. So let's get started. We woke up at Occupy Wall Street to the sound of car horns, stretching our limbs that had been kind of frozen cold by the night, slept outside. We felt like butterflies emerging from a cocoon. We felt reborn. And we felt that the world was being reborn in our hands, that the energy that was emanating from Zuccotti Park and from all the other Occupy sites in the United States, around the world, was going to transform and lift up this dead weight on our shoulders and throw it to the side. And that we could be finally who we really wanted to be. So we made signs, we marched, we protested at Bank of America, and I met people who, although for the first time, felt like old friends, because we were all coming from the same corners of isolation. People who were working too much but making very, very little. People who were living on their credit cards so much that when they took it out, it smoked, and they had to blow it off. People who had bought into the American dream but realized that the dream was no longer available. And we had come together and realized that we weren't alone. So when we wrote Occupy Wall Street and we gathered together, it was the creation of a new consciousness and of a new community, and we hoped of a new world. Some people I met at Occupy Wall Street struck a very personal chord with me. This is a poet. Her name was Aiello. And when we met, we fell passionately in love. And it seemed that our love was also part of this giant wave of the movement. So we would sit at Zuccotti Park with hot tea steaming in our hands and just freestyle poetry for hours. We'd wake up together in our sleeping bags. We'd make the signs. We'd go to the meetings. We'd do the mic check. And she was an incredibly brilliant poet, writer, scholar, and it was like dating Zora Neale Hurston. And then the police raid came. And between 1 o'clock in the morning and 6 a.m., human bulldozers dressed as police came in and ripped down the tents, ripped apart Occupy Wall Street, and ripped apart our dream. And this happened in Occupy sites all across the country. After Occupy ended, my relationship with Aiello also ended, and kind of staggering away from the dream, I went to Burning Man, and it was in 2012. And at Burning Man, I saw a recreation of Occupy on the playa. So I'd like to play this clip.
Absolutely nuts. Wow.
They had Bank
Wow.
on America and Goldman Sachs.
Holy shit.
And these were recreations of banks. So in the flashing light, you could see the columns of a bank, you know, very Roman architecture.
Wow.
And then the fire was beginning to blaze out. Of course, the laser pointers.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah. What?
It's like the bat from Gotham City. It's like the Gotham City bat.
Dude, I think this is so significant.
It's gotta be huge.
Well, it's gonna be so huge.
It all gets going the same.
The heavy thrumming of the music was like living inside of a giant heart that was created by the thousands upon thousands of people there. And all the EDM music, the pulsing beats just rattled our bones. And then the fire began to light.
Oh yeah, they got good power.
You can hear with the screams of the people, the burning of the symbols of capitalism, the symbols of overdraft fees, of embarrassment at how low your bank account is, embarrassment at your student debt that never seems able to get paid off, embarrassment at how little you get paid from your job even though you've gone to college to be able to do it. And all of this anger, all of this resentment directed at capitalism, at the face of capitalism, at the banks, that has made so much money off of our misery. When it began to go on fire, all of us felt something being released from our bodies. And at this time, I was on LSD, and it seemed like the flames were our voices encircling the buildings like gasoline breath, and our thoughts were the ignition, and finally we could see the world that we wanted to finally leave us being burnt down to the ground. You can't fake that joy.
Wow.
That's amazing.
That's amazing.
So here's where one of the first times I felt psychedelics and socialism meet. And it was on the playa where we could act out the fantasy of freedom from capitalism that we couldn't live in our real lives. And there we get to burn down, however false, like a Hollywood Western, just the front of the buildings. They were hollow inside. So it was like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But sometimes burning a symbol can be almost as satisfying as burning the real thing. So then I came back to New York and I felt the weight again. And I think it's a weight that all of us feel. It's the weight of running around from subway to subway. It's the weight of seeing homeless people asking us for things that we don't want to give. It's the weight of putting on a social mask and putting on our makeup and putting on our cologne and perfume and our suits and going out there and, in a sense, giving ourselves away to this machine, hoping we can get something back from it. And I began to ask and wonder and go on this journey, where did this weight come from? Is it something just unique to New York? Is it something just unique to the United States? Is it something unique only to our times? Where did this feeling of heaviness that our bodies are caught up in the gears of a larger machine, where does it come from? So one of the things I began to explore as I'm a college professor, and so I'm constantly surrounded by stacks of books, is this idea of internalized ideology. And one of the thinkers that I found helpful for me was Charles Horton Cooley, specifically Human Nature and the Social Order. So I just read this quote: "Any choice I can make is a synthesis of suggestions derived in one way or another from the general life, and it also reacts upon that life, so that my will is social as being both cause and effect of it." And I followed his idea of the looking glass mirror, the looking glass self, and how our imagination of how we appear to others then in turn creates our reaction to that image, and then finally how we shape our self-image to how we appear to others. So that our identities, our self-image is kind of like a river flowing out of your skull, through your eyes, through your mouth, through your ears. Your self-image is constantly flowing out to other people. It's constantly flowing through your cell phones. It's constantly flowing through the advertisements and the TV screens and the movies and the print words on the page. Our self-identities are constantly flowing in and out. And that one of the tricks of living in a hierarchical society is that our self-images are never just in our body. They travel outside of our body and they get reshaped outside and then delivered back to us. The idea of the looking glass self, of seeing yourself from outside, has precedents that are really striking. So here you have an image of those of us of color, black folks waiting in line, and then above, this kind of middle-class white family with smiles. There's no way like the American way. So imagine yourself living under the image of the advertised good life, knowing that you can never achieve it. You're blocked by your sex, your sexual orientation, by the color of your skin, by your class. Maybe you were once addicted and you have the scars of trauma on your body. That you're blocked from the good life that's advertised everywhere around you. And this is not something just in the past, but even most recently, here there's a famous photo that came from India of homeless people sleeping under an image of Trump as he is sitting on his kind of gaudy gold chair saying there is only one way to live, the Trump way. So if your self-image is sucked out of your body by your cell phones, by the billboards, by the print magazine, by the TV, by the conversations that other people are having, and you are seeing yourself outside of yourself, judging yourself outside of yourself, then it's going further and further and further up in the hierarchy into saying, well, why am I poor? Why am I hungry? Why am I suffering? Why am I broke? Maybe it's my fault. The weight of hierarchy. A cardinal American virtue, ambition, promotes a cardinal American vice, deviant behavior. One of the most important thinkers to me is Robert K. Merton. He's the author of a really important article called Social Structure and Enemy. And he says that in any hierarchical society, there is a strain that comes when you see advertised a good life around you. The smiling faces, the new cars, the rappers with the gold teeth, and Kanye with his beautiful Kardashian. You see advertised a good life, but you don't have any way of getting to it. And it creates a strain between what you think you should get, who you think you should be, versus who you really are and what you really have. And that strain leads to conformity, which is that you just conform to the social order as much as you can. You try to work as hard as you can. Innovation, you try to find alternate routes to get to that good life. And here we talk of crime or possibly art. Ritualism, in which life becomes an empty ritual and you find solace in maybe religion, solace maybe in your identity. Retreatism, in which you actually pull back from society and try to live as isolated as life as possible so that you're not affected by the gravitational pull of the good life. Or, and this is most important for those of us asking the questions of the connection between socialism and psychedelics, rebellion. What happens if you think that your life has enough value on its own that you begin to rebel against the social order that says that you're nothing if you don't look and act and are it? The social order, this idea of a hierarchical society, often works with ideology first. And the practice of ideology is very, 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 very old. One of the oldest examples I found was Plato's Republic. I teach in my Literature Across Cultures course, Plato's myth of the caves. And not too far away from that is this other myth that he sold called the myth of the metals. And in it, there's a conversation. And to give you a framework for this quote, the conversation is, how would you create a stable society? You create a stable society by invoking a noble lie. And that noble lie is that who you are and what you are has a permanent place in society. And you should never try to go above or below that place allotted to you by birth. That what you are determines where you are in society. Those of us, especially of color, know obviously from race, the idea that your race determines where you belong in society. And here I think is an older version of that same idea. So in the myth of the metals in the Republic, Plato said, all of you in the city are certainly brothers, but the God, in fashioning those of you competent to rule, mixed gold in at their birth. And this is why they are the most honored. In auxiliaries, silver, and iron and bronze, in the farmers and craftsmen. Now, as a professor of literature, of course I'm looking at the images. And the idea of using metal, something that's strong and hard and unchanging, as a way to describe who you are, is, again, as the work of metaphors, to take the characteristic of metal, hard and unchanging and permanent, and transferring it over to your lives, saying that you belong in this hierarchy of value, and it is permanent and as unchanging as the qualities of gold, silver, and bronze and iron. So that you will never get higher, you will never get lower, you must remain in your place. I think that ideologies of hierarchy create a counter push, a revolution within the soul, a desire to break out of the place allotted to you by society. And I'd like here to turn to Hegel, who in some ways is the grandfather of socialist thinking. And he obviously was taken up by Karl Marx. And Hegel had, at the very core, especially in his phenomenology of spirit, a section called Lords and Bondsmen. And in it, he describes how the servant, the slave, the bondsman is alienated in the image of the Lord. And here's his description. Self-consciousness is faced by another. It has come out of itself, and it must supersede this otherness and return to itself. So I just want to pause here. When it says self-consciousness is faced by another, you can replace self-consciousness of the servant, of the slave, of the plebeian, of the poor is faced by another. The image of the Lord, the master, the wealthy. It has to come out of itself. It must supersede this otherness and return to itself. So in other words, those who are lower in rank must supersede the image of the powerful, must overcome their image to return to their own lives, to return to their own bodies. And here's why he says work is valuable to the poor and the oppressed. In work, the worker comes to see in the independent being of the object its own independence. So, when the worker creates the world, when the worker creates the pyramids, when the worker creates the castle, when the worker creates capitalism, creates money, she or he can see in what they create their own power, how they actually are the ones who create the world. In their hands begins everything. And we see that today. I see it in the mornings when I go pick up my son, all of the construction workers with their dirty hard hats on the A train and their soiled orange safety vest and their wrinkled jeans and their scuffed hard boots. I see it in the Caribbean women who are going to take care of people's kids, the secretaries who are going to start the office before everyone else comes. I see all this flow of labor going into the city. Through this rediscovery of himself or herself by himself, the bondsman realizes that it is precisely this work wherein he seemed to have only an alienated existence that he acquires a mind of his own. So this comes from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I think that this is the seed core for Karl Marx, who took the spiritual essence of Hegel, the German Romantic philosopher, and as Karl Marx said, flipped it on his head and made it material. And so Karl Marx talked about the social contradictions in every society where labor is alienated. So, of course, the classic opening from the Communist Manifesto, the history of all existing society is a history of class struggle. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, in a word, oppressor and oppressed. In an earlier epoch of history, we find a manifold gradation of rank. But the epoch of the bourgeoisie has simplified the class antagonisms. So this is the bargain that Karl Marx made with history. He credited capitalism, he credited the bourgeoisie for creating the technological means of production to free humanity from toil and labor, to emancipate humanity and to actually make it possible for human beings to have a good quality of life with a minimum amount of labor so that they can pursue play and pleasure, freedom, science, and exploration. And finally, maybe make a leap to the stars. That was his bargain with history. That capitalism within itself has contradictions that lead to a simplification of class antagonisms that would lead eventually to a crisis, to an explosion, where the workers would no longer be alienated in their labor, but see that they are the ones who create the world and finally take ownership of the very things that they have created. And David Harvey, he's a Marxist economist and geographer, succinctly put it this way: once you know that the laws of capitalist motion, that it's a spiral form, you have to produce surplus value. You have to produce more at the end of the day than you had at the beginning of the day. You have to do it on a continuous and faster basis. It means this system has to keep growing. And so he's pointing to the contradiction in capitalism itself, saying that capitalism is a constant spinning spiral, and it devours more and more time of your life. It devours more and more land. It devours more and more water and air. And what does it produce? More and more poverty, more and more boredom, more and more alienation psychologically. Physically, what does it produce? More and more plastic in the oceans, more and more carbon in the sky, more and more pollution of chemicals, fracking in the water so that we're afraid to turn on our faucet. Maybe if we ignite a candle or a match near the faucet, the water will turn on fire, like Josh's Fox documentary. So capitalism, he's saying it is a constant, ever-expanding spiral because it needs to make more money, more profits, consume more resources, both from your life and from the land, until finally it hits a crisis. Part 2. So here I'm at Burning Man again. I'm over at the trash fence, and you can see the sunrises right there reflected on my dusty glasses. I'm coming off of a nice trip, and things were good. While I was at Center Cafe, I saw the sticker, and it was of Bernie Sanders on the playa. It was one of the first times I saw Bernie Sanders in my life. I didn't know who he was. But I was like, Bernie's sexy. He's got a six-pack. I do not have a six-pack. I have a dad bod. But I began to start to question the role of socialism in my mental thought. And I realized that me and Aiello actually during Occupy Wall Street had this conversation. It was like maybe the third or fourth day we had woken up together in a sleeping bag, and we were just getting some coffee. People were very generous at Occupy. They would walk around and give you coffee. Sometimes give you dumpster dived bagels, which was a little bit odd for me. And I told her something honest. I said, you know, I feel so much joy here at Occupy. I feel so much power, so much revolution, but I'm scared. I'm almost scared that things will get out of control and that there'll be a revolution and we'll all be on the streets with fire. And she said, she was always smarter than me in that way. She said, it's because you're petite bourgeoisie. She's like, you come from a working class background. Your mom was on welfare. And you were raised as a petite bourgeoisie, and that's the part of you that has false consciousness. You're afraid of the revolution. And I said, fuck off. And so she laughed. And she's like, it's okay, I'm a little bit afraid too, but that's why I'm here. So I began to understand years or so after Occupy had ended, that feeling of fear. And when I did psychedelics again at Burning Man, I was able to see where that fear came from. And this is a really good statement that I thought came from a book called LSD and Psychotherapy, an exploration of psychedelic and psychoanalytic therapy by W.V. Caldwell. And here's the quote. After taking the drug, a strange enchantment of consciousness that now telescoped itself into a tiny pinpoint of blazing concentration, awareness, instead of focusing on them singly, one by one, like a floodlight, could now spread its beams and observe many levels of the mind. And when I was on LSD on the playa, I could see that there were different levels of my mind. And one level was, I was born in New York. You know, and New York was born in me. You know, I feel the subways rattling in the back of my head all the time. And part of me always wanted for the guys hauling heavy boxes and putting them into the basements of the bodegas, the Arab guys always working 20-hour shifts at the bodegas, the Caribbean nannies with white children getting maybe some health care, the doormen getting a break from the buildings that we always pass by, the people at the bank I always wanted New Yorkers to have a break. Like as a New Yorker, as a child, I was like, man, we're always working so hard. I always wanted us to have a break, you know? But then the other part of me, the bourgeois part of me, was scared of the revolution. And I realized there was a contradiction, a conflict in my mind that was a reflection of society. And that I had internalized the fear of socialism that was actually conservative and actually, to be honest, not true. And the fear of socialism was that if the people pulled down one leader, one oligarchy, one class of people, that we're just going to lift up another. And that we're going to become the Soviet Union, or, I mean, to be honest, Cuba, and a little bit maybe Venezuela. But, you know, the reality is that that's not the kind of socialism that any of us really, I think, imagine, at least when I think of democratic socialism, and even of, say, the Bernie Sanders campaign, that the socialism we're thinking of is really driven by love. It's driven by openness and compassion. And it was also really more New Deal reformism than socialism. So part of me had to reckon with, what kind of socialism am I really asking for? What am I able to embrace? And what am I scared of? And is that fear really internalized conservative ideology? And does that mean I have a split consciousness? And I had to admit, yeah, I do. I've internalized fears from growing up in the 80s and constantly seeing the USSR as someone who's going to launch nuclear missiles towards us. So that's where I thought one of the favorite phrases in the psychedelic circles, which is the shadow, and I said the shadow of class, and obviously Carl Jung. A man who's possessed by his shadow, a woman who is possessed by her shadow, is always standing in their own light and falling into their own traps, living below their own level. And I began to realize that I have a shadow, and that my shadow is a class shadow. That I grew up with the shadow of poverty, and I was always running away from that shadow. And because I live in a city where there's poor people dying on the streets, I'm constantly reminded of how hard poverty is, and I'm constantly running away from it because I don't want to be them. So I may give a couple of tokens for almost religious absolution, but I'm always scrambling towards Wall Street, scrambling towards capitalism because I want to be safe. And I realize I'm running from my own shadow, and it's a class shadow, and it's a shadow that's created by the capitalist ego that I've internalized. So, what did psychedelics help me do? Burn, ego, burn. The contradictions of society are also the contradictions in the self. Dissolving the ego also dissolves the chains of associations that lock us into commodity fetishism. So a word on that. I never, as much as I scrambled towards capitalism, I never quite believed that the things that we're supposed to prize are worth prizing. And part of that is because having an international circle of friends, having them talk to me, having traveled internationally. In 2007, I went to Darfur during the genocide. 2010, I went to Haiti during the earthquake. In New Orleans, I was there in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina, and then I went to Puerto Rico in 2 years ago after the Hurricane Maria. Having gone around, listened, a lot of the stuff that we wear are made by semi-slaves. The shoes that we wear, the sneakers that I have on my feet, probably cost someone a couple of 20, 50 cents, maybe $1 that they get that day. And I paid like, 60, 70 bucks for them. So much of what we wear, so much of what we use, so much of what we have is created by people who are paid very, very little, but yet they're transformed through the alchemy of advertising and celebrity life into a magical status symbol that if we get, we then now tell other people that we are moving on up. And I realize that so much of capitalism is a shell game. We take the products created by poor people, we transform them into celebrity status symbols, weared by Leonardo DiCaprio with the watch, Kanye with everything, and then finally we buy it, and we're just buying into stolen life. Viewing the ego from an inner distance grants us a map of society as a web charged with affect and symbol that's in constant motion, in which we are one hub. So by that I mean is when I took psychedelics, both at Burning Man and here, there was this effect, telescoping effect, where I could see my ego, and I could see that my ego was the center of cause and effect of many other lives and actions. And that because I was now minuscule, I could see myself in honest connection with everyone else. And that the pleasure, the pain, the ideas that were traveling from one person, maybe from centuries ago, traveling through families, traveling through words, zapped me and then passed through me onto other people. And I began to see how interconnected I was to other people because my ego had been dissolved. Agape love becomes a possible force to win over the masses during class conflict. When my ego was dissolved and I saw how wide of a net, of a web that I was connected with everyone else, I became less of an I and more of a we, part of a larger continuum of humanity, which meant that I could now be more forgiving of myself for my own flaws and mistakes. I could be more forgiving of others for their flaws and mistakes. And it led me far away from something that I'm susceptible to from my Catholic upbringing, which is moral fundamentalism. And I began to realize that a lot of times, many of us are being pushed and pulled by forces that are much older and stronger and beyond our control. And when I accepted that, then I began to have a lot more compassion, both for myself and for others. And that opens me up to the possibility of agape love as part of how to win over the masses for class conflict. So this is my definition of psychedelic socialism: using entheogens to seize control of the means of producing the self away from violent hierarchies in order to return to the communal body. So when I say the communal body, as individuals we all are, and we are, you know, each one of you are a unique atom of experience traveling through the universe. There will never be anyone exactly like you. And that's something precious that you should always cherish. But at the same time, what makes it possible for you to have phenomenological experience is your body. And your body doesn't belong to you. Doesn't belong to me. Our body belongs to life. It is an outgrowth, a kind of wedding bouquet of coming out of the DNA blueprint that we all share. And because of that basic blueprint that we all share, we all, in some ways, know each other. We all feel the same basic primary feelings. We all experience the same primary experiences. And so because of that, I think some of the ancient practices that can be updated with technology that the counterculture has to offer us, which is dance, sweating it out, loving, laughing, being risque, being scatological, being profound. All of these things that happen when the counterculture takes over the street in festival culture, I think that that is where the communal body allows us a moment of sacred grace that we can finally leave behind some of our guilt and actually dance with our shadows instead of fighting against our shadows. So psychedelics in the counterculture today. The psychedelic counterculture does have an infrastructure. It has organizations that carry on the mission. It has practices and rituals and ideology. I would say that the strongest, oldest, and longest infrastructure of the psychedelic counterculture is the carnival, but I would break down the carnival into 3 carnivals. One, I think there's the reactionary carnival, and that's the Trump rallies and the neo-Nazi marches. There's a really, really good article called On Fascism. I forgot the author's name, but I can definitely get it to you and email it to you later. But in the article, what it basically says is that fascism is a way for those who are feeling left behind after they've had a secure place in society to gather with others who also feel left behind to create a carnival of hate through which they can love each other again. They hate the others who are taking their position, but they can love each other as the holdouts. And so when I look at Trump rallies, when I look at the neo-Nazi marches, I don't see a very confident white supremacy. I don't see a very confident Christian fundamentalism. I don't see a very confident masculinity. What I see, I mean, this is not Christopher Columbus. This is not Father Knows Best from the 50s. This is a movement driven by fear of losing its place in society. So they're trying to create a carnival where they could come together and feel a brief utopia. And then there's the status quo carnivals. Oh, forgot an L. Sorry, that's my teacher there. Burning Man, rainbow gatherings, and the regionals. I call those the status quo carnivals because those are state sanctioned. Even though lots of drugs and crazy, beautiful orgy dorms happen at Burning Man and sometimes the regionals if you're lucky, and the rainbow gatherings, those are status quo carnivals. Those are carnivals that are totally accepted by the state because they're forms of pressure release. They release the pressure of the hierarchy out into these moments of euphoria and play. But the revolutionary carnival, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, the Indignados, those are where there's no police permit. It's not secluded in private space with tickets, but those are out in the street and they're free for everyone. And that was the magic of Occupy, the magic of the Arab Spring, the beauty of the Indignados is that everyone was welcome. It was just everyone camping out into the street. And when you have something that's welcome for everyone, then that means that some, even of the cynical poor, can show up and be transformed. And even the self-satisfied middle class can show up and be transformed. And even those of us who are afraid of losing our place in society can somehow recreate the society and have a place in it again. And I think that's the revolutionary counterculture. So psychedelic socialism, the next step in the counterculture, is I think that obviously our society is being driven apart, in part, by a capitalism that's faltering. The demographic change, at least in the United States, but I would say in Europe and in the West in general. And one of the ways I think to heal the division between those who feel left behind and those who are making their American dream in their Pakistani accent, in their Puerto Rican accent, in their Venezuelan accent, in their Mandarin accent, Part of the ways to heal that is a renewed social integration through the revolutionary carnival, which means that we seize the streets and make it open for everyone. And knowing that the truth, that what we have to offer, the heartbeat of music, the sweating, the cleaning act of dancing in public together, of listening to each other, of camping out together, taking control of the streets, it actually releases the butterfly from the cocoon. It lets us be new people, because at its core, what the real truth of us is the being, the becoming of life, who we can be, not just who we are. So reclaim life from commodification, taking away more and more parts of our life away from price tags and exchanging in barter and gifting, and the moral fundamentalism and embrace our shadows. And this is for me, from someone who saw identity politics coming from the 90s when we called it being conscious, that identity politics is a good way of raising consciousness, but the trap in identity politics is that we value our own silos of pain and not realizing that pain is not a silo or a well that we drink our own reflection like narcissists, but that pain is a bridge through we cross that bridge and try to lift and carry the other person who's weaker when they're in pain. And finally, end wealth and use the means of production to create a global living standard. I think that at this point is more about species survival. And finally, heal through play. So part 3. About 2 years ago, I discovered that I was going to be a father. And I got a phone call from a friend, and within 2 seconds, I knew what had happened. She said that Aiello, who I knew, had committed suicide. I knew it was coming. She had tried before. And the weight that she had felt constantly in her life, which the rest of us who loved her, who could see her brilliance, who could see that, man, she's got so much Nobel Prize winning art to give to this world. And we wanted for her to give birth to that art. And we could also see the weight, the hierarchy, the shadows constantly trying to crush her. So we were in this constant race. And I'll be honest, a lot of us got tired of it. We're like, oh, God, she takes so much work. But we loved her. But she would disappear because I think she would sense our frustration and try to run away. And so I think she ran away from life. So I was a new father, and I heard about her passing. And then shortly after that, Trump was elected. And I remember going over to Trump Tower, and all of us were giving him the middle fingers. It's almost like we're all like using our fingers as like little dildos, like fuck off, fuck off. And I think what I felt there in that moment was both a shock that we were not at the level of cultural integration that we thought we had been, decency even, but we realized that things were going to get really hard really quick for a lot of us. And so now our back is against the wall because we have a Bernie Sanders campaign, at least I consider myself a supporter, who is currently the front runner, but is going to face a lot of tarring, saying that he's a socialist, and a lot of fear-mongering, saying he's going to come and take your summer home and take your paycheck and increase your taxes and take from you. And finally, he's going to take America from you and give it to those others who don't deserve America. And yet, everything that he's trying to put out in the world would actually save the world, not only for us, but also for those who come after. And I realized that for me, what socialism means is an incredible act of love and generosity, not only to myself. I'm going to be 45 soon. I'm coming at the apex and I'm looking down and I'm good. But I think all of us know someone like him. So that's my son. And I think not only do all of us know someone like him, but I think all of us have that child inside of us, someone who is new. There is a part of you that is always new to this world. Every single second that goes by, your mind creates new energy, new thought. Your soul creates new new space for you to mold and sculpt into a new self. That we are constantly being reborn. That is both the price and the terror of life. So we do have an inner child. And part of what I think democratic socialism means is taking away the hierarchy, taking away the social mask, being vulnerable with other people, and saying, very simply, I want you to live. I want you to live in all of your colors, in all of your sexuality, in all of your ability and disability. I just want you to live. I want you to be the butterfly. And so when I saw him emerging, I realized that he was teaching me something. He was teaching me how to be born. And I think that's what socialism means now in America. We're teaching each other how to be reborn. So thank you.
Can we get a round of applause for Nicholas Powers, please? Thank you so much. So, let's talk about the middle finger dildo thing. Thank you for sharing. Can I ask you a few questions before we open to the crowd?
Yes,
is that all right? Well, I'm doing the typical audience member thing, and I want to make a statement more than a question. I'm going to call a question, but it's more of a statement. Okay, and first question, actually, where are you buying Skechers for $70? Because I can help you with a sweet deal. Yes, you've been overpaying. And anyone else wondering that, or? Yes? Glitter? Oh. That was not my statement or question. I just was trying to ease myself into being on stage again instead of drinking our free wine and talking about socialism. I was on the internet, and I read this article about how it was comparing Eastern and Western philosophy in universities, and how Eastern philosophy is not really seen as something compatible. Like, it's kind of looked down upon by Western philosophers. And one Chinese philosopher they cited as an example of something really important was someone who was part of Mao Zedong's cadre, who argued that Marxism or socialism is kind of incoherent without like an ethical reformation of the individual. And that's something I just wanted to share, statement, question. How I see psychedelics and socialism kind of relating is, it's like an idea about like freeing the means of production. But if you could actually have some like cognitive empathy for the billionaires or for the people who own the means of production, I don't know any. I'm sure someone here might know 1 or 2 billionaires. There's like 600 in our country, but it's not the point. The point is really having kind of empathy for people who have that control. Like if I was some trust fund kid, which I'm totally not, and was given like, hey, do you want to run this oil company and have these means of production and make your livelihood off that, to actually be able to disentangle my identity trajectory from that opportunity, it would definitely require some sort of experience that, like, nothing short of some sort of psychedelic awakening experience. So I really appreciated what you were sharing about, like, decoupling yourself from the fetishization of commodification. And that's just one thing I wanted to share is, like, this Chinese philosopher argued that for all the bells and whistles, it sounds like, of socialism enabling sharing in a communal way of living together, if we don't actually commit to ourselves about finding where we are maybe a little too graspy with things, or like holding on to things, or maybe not giving out $1 or $2 once in a while to some homeless people in the city, then maybe socialism wouldn't work. This person was arguing that, I forgot his name, but that socialism was completely incoherent without an ethical transformation. So that's just one thing I wanted to share. Kind of interesting. Okay. Good night, everybody. My roommates joined me tonight, by the way, also. Betty and Leo. We'll give them a little round of applause for coming out to see me. They're like, what do you do again, Colin? And I was like, I run a legal cult. They're like, okay, yeah. We'll come check it out tonight. We'll be there. Just give us the address. So thank you guys for coming. Nick, you gave a great presentation, and I think people probably would like to ask you a few questions, get a little dialogue going. Anyone have something they'd like to ask our presenter or discuss, perhaps? Yes, go ahead. Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks. That was a great presentation. I enjoyed it so much. First question I want to ask is, I've often found that because taking psychedelic can be such a deeply personal experience, I haven't really thought of it before in terms of a bigger kind of social project, like bring about a socialist society. So I wondered if you have any reflections on how it can be kind of united with that movement, and how the use of psychedelics can be more of a collective project.
What was the last part you said?
How the use of psychedelics could be made more of a collective project rather than an individual one.
Yeah,
Okay.
Nick.
Good, thank you. Most of my experiences on psychedelics have been deeply personal. And more recently, in the past couple of years, I have used psychedelics as a spotlight on how I am connected or disconnected from others. And one of the ways that psychedelics have helped me unveil those connections is, one, by sidestepping, oddly enough, some of the language of the left, because there is a kind of jargon within the left that is, I think, an obstacle to expanding awareness. And two, what I try to do is follow the flow of feeling, of using the kind of hydraulic or water metaphor, saying I know that my consciousness is not simply within my body, that it is something that is shaped by the images that are coming into my brain through my senses from all the screens and worlds around me. I know that I myself have already internalized values along the scale of class, and that I also have bought into values that I think are hollow and empty. So just to be really concrete, I sometimes have read a little bit of Karl Marx, I've read a little bit of Harold Draper, I've read some W. Du Bois, I've read Asada Shakur, and what I try to do is I read them, and before I even take psychedelics, I just write down some ideas that they've had, especially the literary ones, the poets like Allen Ginsberg, or like I said, Asada Shakur and her transformation into a panther, Black Panther. And I write down some of their transformations, some of the insights. And then I go out into the world, and if I'm taking LSD or psilocybin, I actually use it as a spotlight to say, can I use this to look at the world through a class prism? The flow of labor, the flow of value. Where is it coming into me? Where is it leaving? Where am I in all this? And not to use abstract ideas, but to start with my very grounded feelings. The first question I ask is, when did I feel good in terms of class? And I remember when that direct deposit hit, man, I'm just like, I'm making it rain. I'm just like throwing money around like nothing, because I feel really powerful and emboldened when that direct deposit hits. But when I'm tapped out and my bank account is filled with little tumbleweeds, and I'm so stingy, I'm not giving anything to anyone, My mom was like, could you give me some milk? I'm like, no, just drink water. So I use psychedelics as a way of putting a spotlight on the parts of me that are class. Now, why class? I think that class is the deepest form of alienation upon which all the other ones are connected to and then churned. So I'm a man of color. Yeah, I'm light-skinned, but catch me in the summer. And that I could see how color, race, is constantly, this is obvious, constantly commodified. I see how sexuality is constantly commodified. I even see how disability is constantly commodified. So many of the things that we experience as deeply personal are commodified and then sold back to us. So it's as if we have to buy our own identities back from the store shelves. And so I began to ask, I was like, well, using psychedelics as a spotlight in terms of set and setting, and then finally as a container. If psychedelics help dissolve the ego and let you see where you are in a larger flow, then what container are you going to put that back into? And the container that I put it back into is what allows me to achieve the most liberation with the most people? How can my freedom be connected with other people's freedom? And if I don't want to constantly have to sell myself or buy myself back, maybe others don't. So what are the flows of ideology coming in and coming out? What are the flows of commodification coming in, coming out? What are the forms of fetishization coming in, coming out? And once I began to track that through psychedelics, I realized I'm using psychedelics in a way that maybe no one else has yet. And maybe we can start using psychedelics in a way that is new and relevant to our moment right now. I don't want to fetishize the 1968. I think they broke new ground, but in some ways I think they were stumbling blind through chemicals. I don't want to fetishize indigenous cultures because I think that is a different context than what I'm living in. What I need to do is, what does psychedelics help me do right here, right now? And I am trapped in late stage capitalism. And psychedelics helps disintegrate the ego, let me see where I'm at in that, and can help me reconnect with others. So that's how I use psychedelics. Not all the time. Sometimes I just take some Molly and I just want to stand in front of a speaker during some deep house music set and just let it rattle my bones, you know? Or some of you who are, you know, kinky, maybe you're like, let's get the hot wax and like, you know, whips out. That's cool, whatever you think. But I'm saying at least some of the psychedelic use is a spotlight. And don't be ashamed of where you're at right now in space and time. Don't be ashamed of where you're at right now in history. You don't have to fetishize the past, the 68 indigenous cultures. Where are you now? What can psychedelics help us liberate now? And I think class, to me, is where it begins.
Can I ask you where specifically you kind of felt some liberation from the language of the left that you got from psychedelic experience?
I think it's odd. I went to Kimberly Crenshaw, who was of the Kahimbi Collective, who did identity politics. I actually found that what she was trying to do in the beginning was actually very powerful. But I had to return to her because what I found is that identity politics and the language of it, since what she did in 1985, and she was recently on Democracy Now! And she endorsed Bernie Sanders, is she was looking at how all the different layers of systems interact one body. And yeah, intersectionality. So like, imagine like, okay, you're a working class, but then you're also a woman of color. Maybe you're disabled. Do you have HIV? Like, there's all these different. And by the way, the classic example of this is Precious Jones in Push, the novel that also became Precious, the movie. That Sapphire, the poet, was a social worker in Harlem, but then a poet in downtown Manhattan. And so as a social worker, she was seeing kids with HIV, seeing kids who were molested, seeing kids who were living on the street, and she put them all together in one character named Precious Jones. She did that because she wanted to express to people outside of Harlem in the 1980s during the crack era what was going on in New York. And so she created a composite character. And in doing that, she created a neo-slave narrative. My main thing is African-American literature. So she did that. But what happened is that I think in the decade and a half or two after that, as the new millennial generation came up, it began to really shake the foundations of a lot of old legacy institution, which was incredibly healthy. I think what they didn't realize is that they fell into the trap of commodification. And that pain, capitalism can commodify pain and sell it back to you, like victimhood. And what Kimberly Crenshaw and others were doing was saying, no, we want to analyze this to see how we're connected to other people, not how we're trapped in our bodies or trapped in ourselves.
The intention was good.
Yeah, the intention was good. So I just think we need to return to that and then explode that and realize that some of the fetishization or the commodification of our pain is actually capitalism, because we're selling it to institutions, we're selling it to liberal institutions, we're selling it to nonprofits, we're selling it to Hollywood, we're selling it to each other. And we don't need to buy that anymore. What we do need to buy is that we're at a very precarious place in species history. Carbon is flooding the sky, plastic is choking the oceans, poverty is in the streets. Chile, Lebanon, Iraq, Venezuela, people are rising up against neoliberalism. And here we are in New York, which has a history of labor struggle, and I think we can embrace each other and say that we all need to emerge from the cocoon. We all need to fly out together. That's mine.
Anyone else have a question I'd like to ask?
Yeah, so I've got a question about socialism and the interaction with psychedelics. Personally, I use more ayahuasca and iboga. I don't use LSD or psilocybin. So I just don't, personally, when I use psychedelics, it's to overcome fear, because I don't see any difference between the left and the right when the people at the top still have fear, and you see someone like Bernie Sanders get an extra house as a gift when he already has a house. So my personal stratification is, do you have fear or not? Do you have lack or not? Because if you have fear, it doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right. You're going to still consume more and try and pack in more commodities into your heart in the hope that that makes you feel better. So I'm just wondering how your stratification is amenable to less, strip mining of the planet, when I see the same thing happening on both the socialist side and the capitalist side.
No, I feel you so much. I feel you, because there's a form of fear on the left. And the thing is that it's okay. It's okay to admit that we have split contradictory consciousness. I totally confessed that I had a fear of Occupy Wall Street becoming a revolution. Now I don't. But I did at that moment. And that was the conservative part of me. And I think that it is honest to say that human beings, we are incredibly complex. It is the price of our evolutionary history. We are mirroring each other all the time. We have our own bodies that are sending us constant messages, that we are in some ways pulled and pushed and tortured by our own beings. So I get it. And it's okay to call out the left and say, we're acting out of fear. The thing is that we actually have no reason, honestly, to be afraid. We actually have the ability to feed everyone on the planet. Fine. We have the technology to house everyone on the planet. Fine. We also have the ability to
provide reproductive technologies to everyone so that women can choose whether they want to have a kid or not. We have the ability to make sure that our energy is run renewable. Like, so we have we are in an incredibly lucky place in our species history. The thing that's holding us back in some ways is our evolutionary history of tribalism, the sports team mentality, me, us versus them. And I think one thing that those of us who are maybe considering possibly psychedelic socialism is that it's exactly that us versus them divide that is the final obstacle, that situated in what the lowest among us need, those who are the hungry, who are homeless, who are scared, who feel the fear of others running through their bodies like electricity, that starting from there first, building a world that at the very least can take care of some of that. Now, I'll be honest, some of that can never be taken care of. There's some pain that's just part of life. Age is part of life, losing love is part of life, losing loved ones, just pain is a part of life. But some pain doesn't need to be. And I think what you're talking about, though, that some parts of the left actually reaffirm it, is unnecessary. But the thing is that also, again, that's where the compassion comes in. I'm like, well, we're human beings, we gotta work through that. And that for me is where it talks about not moral fundamentalism, but embracing our shadows. That's where humor comes in, sexuality comes in, laughter, dance, double meanings, complicated uses of language, culture. That's where it comes in. Because culture should be at the service of helping us embrace and integrate our shadows rather than telling us that we need to run away from them. Make sense?
Any other questions?
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So you talked about Occupy Wall Street and its reflection as a catharsis of Burning Man, and also Burning Man as a kind of a safe space to explore life briefly without capitalism. But I was wondering if you were aware that there was a long-standing workers' struggle happening at Burning Man for the people who come out there and work for a month and a half and sometimes longer. There's a pay disparity between them and people who are on the board. There's someone who has been working to improve working conditions who was fired, who had to bring a labor lawsuit against the organization and won, and they since hired union-busting lawyers to deal with that. All this stuff is covered in a couple different Salon articles, and the kids who work out there are undereducated. Some of them are homeless, and you know, they're in a position of weakness. So it's just something for people who come to Burning Man to think about how they can support the kids who make their week-long fantasy come true.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I'm not trying to do this rhetorical thing, like, oh, I agree with you to diffuse any tension in the room, like blah blah blah. Like, no, I see it, man. I look, I've been out to the burn early because I had to build the People of Color camp, and that was a lot of work. So when you're out there early, you actually see, and I'm going to use an offensive term because the thing is that I think the offensiveness actually captures the reality of it. The mules. A lot of people go out there, mostly Mexican, not only Mexicans, American, Californian, which is when you go to California a lot, which I've done and I do. One thing you realize is that the racial hierarchies are different than the East Coast. They're white elite. There's African American, not as much. It's mostly Mexican American who are the working poor class and do a lot of the work to keep this whole state floating. So what you're saying, yeah, I saw it. I saw it. And that's why I think the Revolutionary Carnival is better. I think going out there and doing whatever you can. So maybe it's not Burning Man. Maybe it's not the big dome with the flashing lights and the big speakers. Maybe it's something as simple as a drum circle out in the middle of Zuccotti Park or all the parks in Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and in Queens. Maybe it's the Revolutionary Carnival, which is free, that everyone can come to. And you don't have to exploit someone to make your fantasy come true. I think there's some powerful lessons that happen in that fantasy, but I also think that the next level lesson is that you don't need to exploit anyone to make your fantasy come true. You can actually enjoy a deeper human connection by engaging in the work with someone else, talking with someone else. And that's the thing about work. Everywhere you go in New York, you go into these stores, what do you hear? When the customers aren't lined up at the counter, people talk to each other. They share music with each other. They bullshit with each other. The other day I was walking through Canal Street and I saw 4 cops. This one big burly cop was like, yeah, she's in love with her husband and she's in love with me. And the woman cop was like, whoa! And the other cop was like, oh! And I'm just like, why the fuck are these cops not solving crimes? Because they're human beings and they're having affairs and they're fucking up. So they're messy. So I'm just saying all that to tell you, to be honest, is that I hear what you're saying, and there's critiques of any institution. Every institution has a progressive side and a conservative side. And I think obviously Burning Man holds itself out to be a very progressive institution. But it doesn't mean it doesn't have conservative hypocrisy.
Can I think it's to your point earlier with the kind of taxonomy of different revolutionary things. Like Burning Man is still going to have the residue of capitalism because it's a state-sanctioned, as Nick said, event that is still going to have the residue of it. And it's not that the things you brought up aren't important and shouldn't be healed and reconciled and worked through. But I think it's kind of there's like a chasm between like being 85% revolutionary and fully accepting that in an embodied position you're going to take with living out from a revolutionary intention. And I think that's where the non-state sanctioned forms of organizing come in, like the Indigenous and the Occupy Wall Street. I'm just pausing on what I was saying.
Just to let you know, like 5:18, I gotta get back to my son. My babysitters, I don't want my babysitter to leave my fucking son out of the studio.
Yeah.
But we can do like 2 more questions and
Yeah.
then,
Who should
if anyone has any questions, it's fine if you don't.
Ma'am? I saw your hand up earlier.
Oh, thank you.
You talked about the carnival model and the medical model. That's correct. So for many of us, we might exist in both. We might exist in one, but when we roll this out more broadly, it seems, in my mind, a little bit more likely that the medical model might be the more widely used one. So I was just wondering if you could comment on whether the medical model could also draw from the carnival model in some way, or whether it could infuse that in some way.
That's interesting. TMI, too much information. When I went to Darfur in 2009, I went to Darfur and 2007. I went to Darfur and because I reported on the genocide that was happening there. And I came back and I was like really depressed, and I saw a therapist. And we did role play, where I began to role play the different people in my lives. And that was incredibly helpful because I could see myself from outside of myself. And I could see other people from outside of myself. And that was incredibly helpful. And the second point, which I'll connect to what you're saying, I went to Haiti in 2010 during the earthquake, and that was really hard. When I was there, I was very numb. I was very professional. I gave out food, I gave out clothing, I gave out medicine, I reported, and there were bodies in the street, severed carcasses in the street. And the very last day, we dug people out from rubble. And the very last day, I remember seeing what I thought was a soccer ball, and I came up to it, there was a baby. I fucking got out. And I was suicidal for like 3 months. I couldn't feel anything at all. And I went to a therapist, and again, helped me through play, acting out, role playing, to get through that. So in terms of therapy strategies, I think almost anything is on the table. So talk therapy, play therapy, role-playing therapy, and there's so many different obvious forms of therapy that can be used to help people reconnect with themselves. And the medical model is incredibly important because it helps individuals get back into their bodies after they've been traumatized. So I think Rick Doblin from MAPS had one example of an American soldier who's coming back from Iraq after having lost a lot of his friends there, and he was deeply traumatized and drinking and just out of it. He was in some ways using his trauma as a way of apologizing to his dead friends. When he took MDMA, he was allowed to talk to his friends, and in his mind, his friends who had died in Iraq told him, don't destroy your life for us. We want you to live. And so he stopped drinking, he stopped destroying himself, and he actually allowed himself to live. So all that to say is that I think that the medical model is incredibly important, and I think the next level could be, how does the medical model help us see the pain that is created by systems, not just by the happenstance of life, not by just by the individual absurd chance occurrences of life, but how does it show us how systems create pain in our lives? And if we can quantify and legitimize that, then we have a strong case to push back against these systems and say, these systems are causing an incredible amount of unnecessary pain. And I think that's where, if anyone wants to read Hannah Arendt's, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, in which she studied the trial of Eichmann, the Nazi war criminal, in Jerusalem. And what she came out of that with is that Eichmann was a boring bureaucrat. He wasn't a vampire, he wasn't this like sociopath, he was just a bureaucrat. And what she said is that most evil done in systems happens because people are bureaucrats plugged into one role in a larger system that produces carcasses, gas chambers, poverty, or death, or environmental destruction. So one of the things that maybe the medical model can eventually grow into is, how does the pain that is in our lives and that what we cause others, because we are in social roles within larger institutions that create this Eichmann in Jerusalem style, and that if we become aware of that, maybe we can subtract ourselves away from it.
That's all the time we have, unfortunately. I wanted to give a quick mention. Right after this, there is a decriminalization forum happening, not super far from here, for medicinal herbs and fungi. It's at 208 West 13th Street, and there will be food provided by the Occupy Wall Street kitchen. But it's going to be a really cool forum from 6 to 8, 208 West 13th Street, room 101. Just wanted to give a shout. I'm going to head there after this, but just wanted to give that little announcement. And can we give a round of applause to Nick Powers, please?
Just one last thing. This is a collective project. This is obviously just a very rough draft. And just like at Occupy, just like at Me Too, just at like BLM, and just whatever next movement comes, it's all of us that actually make the movement happen. So I am more than happy if anyone wants, I can email out to everyone the PowerPoint. Feel free to take it and do with it what you need to do. So many of you have friends and family that trust you. They don't need to hear it from me. They may not even believe me. They'll be like, oh, who the fuck this guy is? But they'll trust you. Take it and put into this model your experiences, your ideas. Make it yours, and then let it carry forth. We have to get away from the one-person messianic model and get back into the community model where we create the revolution, not one person. So if you want this, it's yours. Do with it what you will. There's no copyright on it. I'm just asking that you do right by it. Be honest with it. It's yours. Psychedelic socialism is yours.
Thank you guys for coming.